Sarah watched her 4 children vanish beneath the raging floodwaters, her world collapsing until a lone Apache hunter dove into the deadly current without hesitation. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Arizona Territory, summer of 1875. The sky darkened with sudden ferocity, turning the afternoon into an ominous twilight. Thunder rolled across the canyon walls like angry spirits, echoing through the ravines that cut deep into the red earth. Makia paused in his gathering of willow bark, his weathered hands stilling as he raised his head to scent the air. At 34, the Apache hunter had learned to read nature's warnings with the same precision that he tracked deer through the wilderness. Something was wrong. The river below, usually a gentle ribbon of silver threading its way through the valley, had begun to swell. The distant rumble wasn't just thunder, it was water, a wall of it, churning and gathering strength as it rushed down from the mountains where the storm had broken hours earlier. Flash flood. Makia secured his medicine pouch at his waist and moved with swift, silent steps toward higher ground. The monsoon season had come early this year, bringing with it unpredictable storms that transformed placid streams into raging torrents within minutes. His people knew better than to linger near the riverbanks during these months, but the white settlers who had established themselves at the edge of Apache territory often failed to heed such wisdom. That's when he heard it, a woman's scream, thin and desperate against the growing roar of the water. Makia turned sharply, his dark eyes scanning the bend in the river. There, on a small peninsula that was rapidly disappearing beneath the rising current, stood a woman clutching a small child to her chest. 3 other children huddled against her skirts, their faces pale with terror. "Help us!" she cried out, her voice barely carrying over the churning water. "Please, somebody help!" Makia didn't hesitate. He descended the slope with the sure-footedness of a mountain lion, calculating the river's path and the rapidly vanishing ground beneath the family's feet. The woman's eyes found his, wide, blue, and filled with a desperate hope that struck him like a physical blow. He recognized her then, the widow Blackwood Sarah. She had moved to the small homestead at the edge of the reservation just months ago, after her husband had been killed in a mining accident. The Apache Council had watched warily as she established herself with her 4 young children, scratching out a living from the hard soil with a determination that had gradually earned their grudging respect. Now, that determination was giving way to raw fear as the water rose around her ankles, then her calves. The smallest child in her arms couldn't have been more than 2 years old, while the oldest, a boy with his mother's golden hair, appeared no older than 8. "Stay still," Makia called out in English, a language he had learned during his years scouting for the army before returning to his people. "I'm coming to you." The peninsula was nearly gone, the rushing water now a churning maelstrom of mud, debris, and uprooted vegetation. Makia removed his deerskin shirt and moccasins, securing them high on a branch. Then, with a deep breath, he plunged into the frigid current. The force of it nearly swept him away immediately. The flood was stronger than he had anticipated, carrying with it branches and rocks that threatened to knock him unconscious. But Makia had been swimming these waters since childhood. He knew how to move with the current rather than against it, angling his powerful body to cut through the turbulence. Sarah watched him approach, her face a mask of desperate hope. The peninsula was now barely large enough for them to stand on, the water swirling around her waist. The children whimpered, clinging to her with white-knuckled fingers. "Take them first," she pleaded as Makia reached them, water streaming from his copper skin. "Please, take my children." Makia assessed the situation with the cold logic of a hunter. The woman was taller, stronger. The oldest boy might manage with guidance, but the three younger ones would never survive the current. "You," he said firmly, reaching for the toddler in her arms. "You come first, with the smallest. I'll return for the others." Before she could protest, a section of the peninsula crumbled beneath them. The current surged, and suddenly they were all in the water. Sarah's scream cut short as she went under. Makia lunged for her, his arm locking around her waist as the other children were torn from her grasp by the merciless water. "My babies!" she screamed as she surfaced, thrashing against his hold. "My children!" The toddler still clung to her, sputtering and wailing, but the other three had been swept away downstream, their small heads barely visible among the churning froth before disappearing around a bend. "I will find them," Makia promised, his voice cutting through her panic like a blade. "But first, you must live." Fighting against both the current and her desperate struggles, Makia pulled Sarah and her youngest child toward the shore. The journey seemed endless, each stroke a battle against the river's rage. Sarah had stopped fighting him, her energy giving way to a numb shock as the realization of what had happened sank in. Her other children, gone in an instant, swallowed by the unforgiving waters. By the time they reached the riverbank, Sarah was barely conscious, her arms locked in a death grip around her toddler. Makia dragged them onto solid ground, his own muscles trembling with exertion, but there was no time to rest. "Stay here," he commanded, helping her sit against a boulder well above the floodline. "Keep your child warm. I will find the others." Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with mud and tears, her blue eyes hollow with a grief too vast for words. "They're gone," she whispered. "The river took them." Makia's expression hardened. "No," he said simply, "not while I breathe." Without another word, he turned and raced downstream, following the path the flood had carved through the canyon. Behind him, Sarah Blackwood clutched her remaining child and watched him disappear, a solitary figure running along the edge of destruction with a determination that defied the cruel indifference of nature itself. Makia ran as he had never run before, his bare feet finding purchase on the slippery rocks with an instinct born of a lifetime in these canyons. The flood waters churned beside him, carrying tree trunks and debris with frightening speed. Each second that passed pushed the children further downstream, further from safety, further from life itself. His mind remained sharply focused, shutting out the despair that would have paralyzed another man. The Apache hunter had been taught since childhood that emotion was a luxury that could cost lives in the wilderness. What mattered now were signs, tracks, the small evidences of passage that most eyes would miss. The river bent sharply around a cluster of boulders, widening into a shallow basin where the current slowed. Makia paused, scanning the edges where flotsam collected in the eddies. A flash of fabric caught his eye, a scrap of blue cotton snagged on a protruding branch. He waded into the shallows and retrieved it, recognizing it as part of the dress worn by one of the girls. Hope flared within him. The child had passed this way, and recently, "Hotawis," he whispered in his native tongue. "Give me strength." He rarely prayed, but this was not a day for pride. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained leaden, threatening to unleash another deluge. Makia continued downstream, his eyes missing nothing, a disturbed patch of mud here, a broken twig there. The signs were subtle, but to him they shouted as loudly as footprints in fresh snow. Half a mile further, the river narrowed again, squeezing through a gorge barely 10 feet wide. The water raged through this natural funnel with terrible force, but along the edges there were small shelves of rock where debris and perhaps a desperate child might find temporary sanctuary. Makia climbed along the cliff face, his fingers finding invisible holes in the red sandstone. There, huddled on a narrow ledge barely above the water, was a small figure. The oldest boy, his golden hair plastered to his head, clothes torn and bloodied, but alive. His eyes were wide with terror, his body trembling violently from cold and shock. "I'm here to help," Makia called out, the English words strange on his tongue. "Your mother sent me." The boy didn't respond, his gaze vacant. Shock, Makia realized. He had seen it before in warriors who had witnessed too much death. He inched closer along the rock face, careful not to startle the child into falling. "Taunt, what is your name?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. For a moment the boy said nothing. Then, in a voice barely audible above the water's roar, James Blackwood." "James," Makia repeated, reaching the ledge at last. "I am Makia. I will take you to your mother." The boy's eyes focused slightly at the mention of his mother. "Emma," he whispered. "Lily. Thomas." The water took them. Makia crouched beside him, assessing him for injuries. A nasty gash on his forehead, bruises forming on his arms, but his limbs appeared unbroken. "Your mother and smallest brother are safe," he assured the boy. "Now we will find the others." James shook his head, tears cutting clean tracks through the mud on his face. "Gone," he choked. "I tried to hold on to Lily, but the water was too strong." Makia's hand came to rest on the boy's shoulder. "The river has not beaten us yet," he said simply. "Can you walk?" James nodded uncertainly. Makia helped him to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. "Good. You are brave like your mother. Now we follow the river." As they made their way carefully back to the shore, Makia's thoughts turned to Sarah Blackwood. He had watched her from a distance these past months, as had many in his tribe. The white woman who refused to leave, even when the winter had frozen the ground so hard that breaking it for her husband's grave had taken 3 days. She had stood there in the bitter cold, her children huddled against her, as the local preacher spoke words over the pine box that held all that remained of Thomas Blackwood. The Apache Council had debated asking the Indian agent to have her removed. A white woman alone was unusual enough to cause concern, but Sarah had surprised them all. Instead of retreating to the safety of the white settlements, she had stubbornly remained, planting crops, raising chickens, teaching her children to coax life from the reluctant soil. She nodded respectfully when she encountered tribal members, never showing fear or disdain. She minded her boundaries and kept to herself. Makia had admired her quiet determination. It reminded him of his own mother, who had raised 5 children alone after his father was killed by Mexican soldiers. That same strength had been in Sarah's eyes as she clutched her toddler at the riverbank, not surrender, but a ferocious will to protect what remained of her family. With James following unsteadily behind him, Makia continued downriver, where the flood had begun to spread out across a wider floodplain. Here, the current lost some of its fury, but new dangers emerged: quicksand, hidden sinkholes, and the cold that would claim a child's life long before an adult would succumb. "Stay close," he instructed James, whose shivering had intensified. "Tell me about your sisters and brother." "What do they look like?" The boy's voice was mechanical, but the question gave him focus. "Lily is 6. She's wearing a blue dress. Her hair is blonde, like mine. Emma is 4. She has red hair, like Papa did. She has a rag doll she never lets go. Thomas is 3. He's small for his age, dark hair, like Mama. He was wearing brown trousers and no shoes." Makia committed these details to memory. Red hair would be easier to spot among the muddy debris. A doll might catch on branches where a small body could be swept past. They had gone another quarter-mile when James suddenly stumbled, pointing weakly to a tangle of uprooted cottonwood trees that had formed a natural dam. "There," he gasped. "I see her. I see Emma." Makia followed his gaze. Trapped in the branches of the fallen trees was a splash of color, a small arm in a faded yellow sleeve, unmoving. His heart clenched, but he kept his expression neutral for the boy's sake. "Wait here," he ordered, moving swiftly toward the logjam. The footing was treacherous, the logs shifting under his weight. One wrong step and he would be crushed between the massive trunks or sucked under by the current still flowing beneath them. Inch by inch, he made his way toward the small figure. Emma Blackwood lay draped across a branch, her red hair tangled in the smaller twigs. Her eyes were closed, her skin pale beneath the mud that covered her. For a terrible moment, Makia thought they were too late. Then he saw the faintest movement, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Emma," he called softly, reaching her at last. "Emma, wake up!" The little girl's eyelids fluttered. A faint moan escaped her blue-tinged lips. She was alive, but badly chilled and growing weaker by the minute. Makia worked quickly, freeing her hair from the branches and gathering her small body into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of soaked clothing and cold limbs. "My doll," she whispered as he lifted her, her voice barely audible. "My doll. We will find you another," Makia promised, though he knew such comfort was hollow. The loss of a beloved toy would soon be forgotten in the greater grief that might yet come. With Emma secure in his arms, he carefully retraced his steps across the logjam. James waited anxiously on the shore, his young face drawn with a weariness no child should know. "Is she alive?" he asked, his voice cracking. Makia nodded, placing Emma gently on a patch of grass. "She needs warmth," he said, removing his leather vest and wrapping it around the little girl. "You must hold her while I look for the others." James nodded solemnly, sitting down and pulling his sister close. "I won't let go this time," he promised, more to Emma than to Makia. The Apache hunter straightened, scanning the continuing path of destruction carved by the flood. Two found, two still missing, and somewhere upstream, a mother waited in an agony of uncertainty that he could scarcely imagine. The sky was darkening as evening approached, bringing with it the desert's biting cold. Time was running out. The shadows lengthened across the valley as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. Makia moved with increasing urgency, his eyes constantly scanning the flood-ravaged landscape. The river had begun to recede, leaving behind a wasteland of mud, uprooted vegetation, and scattered debris. What had once been a vibrant riparian ecosystem now resembled the aftermath of war. Nature's violence laid bare in stark relief. Two children remained missing. Lily, the 6-year-old in the blue dress, and Thomas, the 3-year-old who had been wearing brown trousers. With each passing minute, the chance of finding them alive diminished. Hypothermia would claim them long before starvation, and injuries sustained during their violent journey downstream could have already proven fatal, but Makia refused to surrender to such thoughts. He had been tracking since he was old enough to walk, following his father through these same canyons and valleys, learning to read the subtle signs that most would overlook: a bent blade of grass, a displaced pebble, the faint impression of a small hand in softened mud. He paused at the edge of a shallow pool that had formed where the floodwaters were receding. Something caught his eye, a flash of blue fabric half buried in silt. His heart quickened as he waded in, his fingers closing around the sodden material. It was not Lily, but her doll, its button eyes staring blankly up at him. Yarn hair matted with mud. Makia tucked the doll into his belt. If nothing else, it would be something to return to the family, a small comfort in the face of overwhelming loss. The land opened up ahead into a broad floodplain where the river had spread out, losing much of its destructive force. Here, debris had collected in uneven piles, branches, reeds, and the occasional man-made object swept from homesteads upstream. Makia approached these piles methodically, checking each one for signs of the missing children. As he worked, his mind drifted to the white settlers who had gradually encroached on Apache lands over the past decade. Most regarded his people with fear or contempt, viewing them as obstacles to be removed rather than fellow human beings with an ancient claim to the land. The Indian agents spoke of peace, while soldiers built forts and miners staked claims. Treaties were signed, then broken when gold or silver was discovered. Sarah Blackwood was different. She had come with her husband during the initial rush of settlers, but unlike many, they had sought permission from the tribal council to establish their small homestead at the boundary of the reservation. Thomas Blackwood had been respectful, if somewhat reserved, offering fair trades for knowledge about local hunting grounds and water sources. After his death, many expected Sarah to flee back east to the safety of white civilization. Instead, she had dug in her heels, working the land with a stubborn persistence that had gradually earned the respect of even the most skeptical tribal elders. She kept to herself, but nodded respectfully when encountering Apache women at the trading post, and once had even shared her medicines when influenza swept through a nearby Apache settlement. A cry interrupted Makia's thoughts, faint, almost inaudible above the gurgle of receding water. He froze, holding his breath to listen. There it came again, a child's whimper somewhere to his right. "Lily!" he called out, wading through ankle-deep water toward a massive tangle of branches and flood debris. "Lily Blackwood!" The whimpering stopped, replaced by a frightened silence. Makia approached the debris pile carefully, aware that it could shift and collapse at any moment. "I am here to help," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Your mother and brother are waiting for you," a small voice finally responded, trembling with cold and fear. "Are you an Indian?" "I am Apache," Makia confirmed, spotting a flash of pale skin and blonde hair within the wooden maze. "My name is Makia. Your brother James is safe. So is Emma." "Where's Thomas?" the voice asked, growing slightly stronger. "He was with me, but then the water took him away." Makia felt a pang of concern, but kept his expression neutral. "We will find him," he promised. "First, you must come out so I can take you to your mother." He began carefully dismantling the debris pile, removing branches one by one until he revealed a small cavity where Lily Blackwood had taken refuge. The little girl was huddled in a ball, her blue dress torn and muddied, her blonde hair a tangled mess. Her face and arms were scratched from the branches, and her lips had a bluish tinge that worried Makia greatly. "Can you move?" he asked, extending his hand. Lily nodded, reaching out with fingers so cold they felt like ice against his skin. She winced as she tried to stand. "My ankle hurts," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Makia examined it quickly, swollen but not obviously broken. "I will carry you," he said, lifting her gently. "Hold tight to my neck." Lily hesitated for only a moment before wrapping her thin arms around him, burying her face against his shoulder. She was shivering violently, her small body radiating cold through her wet clothes. "I found your doll," Makia told her, retrieving the muddy toy from his belt and placing it in her hands. Lily clutched it to her chest, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thomas gave it to me," she whispered, "before the water took him." Makia's jaw tightened. The boy had been with her, then separated. If Thomas had been swept away while Lily found refuge in the debris pile, he could be anywhere downstream, or worse, trapped beneath the surface where no eye could spot him. With Lily secure in his arms, Makia continued his search, following the river's destructive path. The light was fading rapidly now, the twilight deepening the shadows in the ravaged landscape. Soon, darkness would make the search nearly impossible. "Thomas!" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Thomas Blackwood!" Only silence answered him. Lily had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign. Her body was giving up the fight against the cold. Makia needed to get her back to her mother and siblings, to warmth and safety, but the thought of abandoning the search for the last child tore at him. He had nearly decided to turn back when he spotted something at the edge of his vision, a small, dark shape on a sandbar that had emerged as the waters receded. It wasn't moving, but something about it seemed deliberate rather than random, like the other debris scattered across the landscape. Makia approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the figure of a small boy, lying on his side with his back to the river. He was half buried in silt, his dark hair plastered to his head, his brown trousers torn at the knee. "Thomas," Makia breathed, setting Lily down gently on a dry patch of ground. "Stay here," he instructed her. "I need to check on your brother." Lily nodded mutely, her eyes wide with fear and hope as Makia rushed to the small, still form. The boy wasn't breathing. His skin was cold and pale, his lips blue, his eyes closed as if in sleep. Makia felt for a pulse at the child's neck. Nothing. The river had claimed its victim after all. But something in Makia refused to accept it. He had seen life return to those at the edge of death before. His grandmother, a revered medicine woman, had taught him that the spirit sometimes hovered near the body, reluctant to begin its journey to the next world. He turned Thomas onto his back, clearing mud from the boy's nose and mouth. Then, with determined movements, he pressed on the small chest, forcing water from the lungs. Again and again he pressed, pausing occasionally to breathe into the child's mouth as his grandmother had once shown him. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice harsh with effort. "Thomas Blackwood, breathe." Nothing happened. Makia continued, refusing to surrender. Lily watched silently from where he had left her, clutching her doll with white-knuckled fingers. Just as Makia was beginning to accept the bitter truth, Thomas's body suddenly convulsed. Water gushed from his mouth, and he drew in a ragged, desperate breath, then another. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open, his body instinctively fighting for the air it had been denied. "Lily!" Makia called, relief flooding through him. "Your brother lives!" The little girl tried to stand but collapsed, her injured ankle unable to support her weight. She crawled instead, dragging herself across the mud to reach her brother's side. "Tommy," she sobbed, touching his face with trembling fingers. "Tommy, wake up." Thomas didn't respond to her voice, but his breathing had steadied somewhat. He was alive, but barely. Hypothermia still threatened to claim him, and whatever injuries he had sustained during his ordeal remained unknown. Makia gathered the boy in his arms, wrapping him in the remains of his own shirt. "We must get them back to their mother," he said, helping Lily to her feet. "Can you walk if I help you?" Lily nodded bravely, though tears of pain streaked her face. "Is Mama really okay?" she asked, her voice small. "She is waiting for you," Makia assured her. "Your youngest brother is with her. James and Emma are waiting too." With Thomas cradled against his chest and Lily leaning heavily on his arm, Makia began the long journey back upstream. The path was treacherous in the fading light, the ground uneven and still slick with mud. Lily stumbled frequently, whimpering with pain but refusing to stop. "You are very brave," Makia told her as he steadied her for the dozenth time. Like a little warrior." Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes serious in her mud-streaked face. "Papa said we had to be brave out here," she said. "He said the frontier wasn't for cowards." "Your father was right," Makia replied, something tightening in his chest. Thomas Blackwood had been a stern man by all accounts, but he had clearly loved his family. What would he think of an Apache warrior rescuing his children? Would he be grateful, or would the prejudice so common among white settlers override his relief? Such questions were meaningless now. Thomas Blackwood was dead, and his widow waited with the torment of uncertainty crushing her spirit. Makia adjusted his grip on the unconscious boy and urged Lily forward. The last light was fading from the sky, and the desert night would bring a cold that could kill as surely as the flood. The dying light of day had long since faded to darkness by the time Makia reached the spot where he had left James and Emma. Night had spread its star-studded canopy across the desert sky, the moon casting a pale silver glow over the devastated landscape. The temperature had dropped sharply, as it always did in the desert after sunset, the cold air settling into the canyon like water filling a basin. Makia called out softly as he approached, not wanting to startle the children. "James, Emma, I have returned." For a terrible moment, there was no response. Then a small shape moved in the shadows. James emerged from beneath a rocky overhang where he had taken shelter with his sister. "Mr. Makia." The boy's voice was weak with exhaustion. "Did you find them?" "Yes," Makia confirmed, kneeling carefully to set Thomas down without disturbing him. Lily collapsed beside her unconscious brother, her strength finally giving out now that they had reached relative safety. James rushed forward, his face a mixture of relief and anguish as he saw his siblings. Are they alive?" "They live," Makia assured him, "but they are very cold and tired." Thomas breathes, but he does not wake. He checked Emma, who was curled against the spot where James had been sitting. The little girl's shivering had subsided somewhat, a good sign. Her brother had kept her warm enough to prevent the worst effects of the cold. "We must return to your mother," Makia said, gathering Thomas in his arms once more. "She has waited too long already." James nodded, helping Emma to her feet. The 4-year-old swayed unsteadily, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "I'm so tired," she whimpered. "And I want Mama. You will see her soon," Makia promised. "James, can you carry your sister?" The boy straightened his shoulders, determination overcoming his fatigue. "Yes, sir, I can carry her." "I will take Thomas and help Lily," Makia said. "Stay close. The path is dangerous in darkness." With James carrying Emma piggyback and Makia supporting Lily with one arm while cradling Thomas with the other, they began the slow journey upstream. The terrain was challenging, especially in the dark, with flood debris creating obstacles at every turn. Lily limped beside Makia, occasionally stumbling but pressing on with a stoicism that belied her 6 years. Miles away, at the spot where Makia had left her, Sarah Blackwood maintained her vigil. The small fire he had built for her before departing had dwindled to embers, but she hadn't noticed. Her attention was fixed on the darkened canyon downstream, straining for any sign of movement, any sound that might herald the return of her children. Her youngest son, Michael, had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully in her lap. Sarah absently stroked his damp hair, her other hand clutching the small silver cross that hung around her neck, the last gift Thomas had given her before the mining accident that claimed his life. Please, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was addressing, God, fate, or the stoic Apache man who had vanished into the gathering darkness hours earlier. Please bring them back to me. The world had already taken so much from her. Her parents to influenza when she was just 16, her brothers to the war between the states, her beloved Thomas to the unforgiving depths of a silver mine. Each loss had carved away a piece of her, leaving calluses where there had once been softness. But her children, they were different. They were her heart beating outside her body, her reason for drawing breath each morning, for pushing through the bone-deep weariness that had become her constant companion. Without them, there would be nothing left of Sarah Blackwood but an empty shell going through the motions of living. A movement in the darkness snapped her from her reverie. She leaned forward, heart hammering against her ribs. Was it just the wind stirring the bushes or something more? "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. Sarah clutched Michael tighter, eyes burning from hours of desperate vigilance. Then faintly, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, accompanied by the softer padding of children's feet. "Mama!" A child's voice, high and clear despite its exhaustion, sliced through the night. "Mama, we're here!" Sarah surged to her feet, nearly dropping Michael in her haste. The toddler woke with a startled cry, but Sarah barely noticed. She stumbled forward, toward the voices that had haunted her prayers for hours. They emerged from the shadows like apparitions, James first, carrying a half-asleep Emma on his back, followed by Makia, supporting a limping Lily with one arm while cradling an unconscious Thomas against his chest. Their forms materialized gradually in the moonlight, spectral at first, then solidifying into the miracle Sarah had been begging for. "My babies," she sobbed, rushing to meet them. "Oh, my babies," James gently set Emma down, and the little girl ran the last few steps into her mother's embrace. Sarah fell to her knees, gathering Emma and James against her with one arm while still holding Michael with the other. Tears streamed unchecked down her face as she kissed their mud-streaked foreheads, their cold cheeks, reassuring herself that they were real, that they were alive. "Lily!" she gasped, reaching toward her oldest daughter, who still leaned heavily against Makia. "Thomas?" "Lily's ankle is hurt," Makia explained, helping the girl hobble the last few steps to her mother. "Thomas lives, but he swallowed much water. He needs warmth and rest." Sarah released her other children to take Thomas from Makia's arms. The boy's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. She pressed him against her chest, her tears falling onto his cold face. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Makia with a gratitude so profound it seemed to illuminate her from within. "Thank you for bringing them back to me." Makia nodded once, his expression remaining stoic despite the emotion that tightened his throat. "The fire has nearly died," he observed. "Your children need warmth." Sarah glanced at the dying embers, then back at her children. They were all soaking wet, shivering in the desert night, their clothes torn and muddied. She had nothing to offer them. No dry clothes, no blankets, no shelter. Everything had been swept away in the flood. Makia seemed to read her thoughts. "My village is closer than your homestead," he said. "There, we can give them dry clothes, warm food, and medicine for Thomas and Lily." Sarah hesitated. She had never entered an Apache settlement, though she had seen them from a distance. The reservation boundary had been an invisible line she respected, never crossing without explicit invitation. To enter their space now, as a white woman with 4 half-drowned white children, seemed a presumption too great. Yet what choice did she have? Her children would not survive the night without proper care, and her own homestead was miles away, likely damaged by the same flood that had nearly claimed her family. "If you're certain we would be welcome," she said finally, her pride giving way to maternal practicality. "You will be welcome," Makya assured her, though in truth he was not entirely certain. His people were wary of outsiders, with good reason. But the children's need overrode such concerns. The Apache did not turn away those in genuine distress, especially not children. "Can you walk?" he asked Sarah. She nodded, shifting Thomas in her arms and reaching out to steady Lily. "We'll manage." Makya looked at the family, the mother with her youngest and oldest sons, the daughter limping beside her, the older boy supporting his younger sister. They were exhausted, injured, pushed to the limits of human endurance, but they were together. And in that togetherness, they had found a strength that even the raging river had failed to overcome. "Then we go," he said simply, leading the way into the moonlit desert, toward the Apache village nestled in the shadow of the sacred mountains that had watched over his people since time beyond memory. The Apache village appeared first as a scattering of small fires against the darkness, like fallen stars gathered in the valley's embrace. As they drew closer, the silhouettes of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made from brush and earth, materialized from the shadows. Dogs barked a warning, alert to the approaching strangers, and soon human figures emerged from the structures, their faces illuminated by firelight and suspicion. Sarah instinctively drew her children closer, years of frontier stories about savage Indians rising unbidden in her mind. She pushed the thoughts away, ashamed. This man had saved her children's lives. His people deserved better than her fear. Makya raised his hand in greeting, calling out in his native tongue. An older man stepped forward, his face deeply lined with age and wisdom, his long hair streaked with silver. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, but there was an unmistakable authority in his bearing. The tribal elder, Sarah guessed, or perhaps the chief. The two men spoke rapidly in Apache, Makya gesturing occasionally towards Sarah and the children. She couldn't understand the words, but the elder's expression shifted from wariness to something more complex, a mixture of concern and resignation. Finally, he nodded and turned to the gathered villagers, issuing what sounded like instructions. "My grandfather welcomes you," Makya explained, turning to Sarah. "He says the children of the river must be warmed by the sacred fire." Several women approached, their initial reserve melting somewhat at the sight of the bedraggled children. One elderly woman with hands gnarled by arthritis reached out to touch Thomas's forehead, frowning at the clammy feel of his skin. She spoke urgently to Makya, who nodded. "Nahimana is our medicine woman," he explained to Sarah. "She says Thomas must be treated quickly. The water spirit still holds him." Sarah clutched her unconscious son tighter. "What does that mean? What's wrong with him?" Makya's expression softened slightly. "His lungs are filled with river water. She has medicines that will help draw it out." A younger woman approached Emma, who shrank against her mother's skirts. The Apache woman knelt to the child's level, her eyes gentle. She held out a small wooden bowl filled with something that steamed in the cool night air. "It is pine needle tea," Makya translated, "for warmth and strength." Emma looked up at her mother, uncertain. Sarah nodded encouragingly, though her own heart raced with the strangeness of their situation. "It's all right, sweetheart. These people are helping us." Hesitantly, Emma accepted the bowl, taking a small sip of the fragrant liquid. Her eyes widened in surprise. "It's sweet," she murmured. "Honey," Makya confirmed, "from wild bees." More women appeared, carrying blankets woven in geometric patterns of red, black, and white. They wrapped them around the shivering children, their movements efficient but gentle. One woman, younger than the rest with a baby strapped to her back, approached Lily, examining her swollen ankle with careful hands. "Nita is skilled with injuries," Makya told them. "She will bind Lily's ankle properly." Sarah watched as her children were tended to by these strangers, these people she had been taught to fear. Their kindness, in the face of her family's desperate need, humbled her. "Please thank them for me," she said to Makya, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell them I am grateful beyond words." He translated, and the women nodded, some smiling slightly. The initial tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had eased. These were not faceless Indians from frightening fireside tales. They were mothers, grandmothers, healers, their humanity no different from her own. Thomas was carried to Nahimana's wickiup, a slightly larger structure set apart from the others. Sarah followed anxiously, unwilling to let her son out of her sight. Inside, a fire burned in a central pit, filling the space with warmth and the aromatic scent of burning cedar. The old medicine woman directed them to place Thomas on a bed of soft furs near the fire. With deft movements that belied her age, Nahimana began mixing herbs in a stone mortar, grinding them to a paste while murmuring what sounded like prayers. She gestured for Sarah to remove Thomas's wet clothes, which she did with trembling fingers. Another woman brought a soft buckskin garment, a child's shirt, slightly too large for Thomas but clean and dry. Once the boy was redressed and wrapped in warm blankets, Nahimana approached with her herbal mixture. She indicated that Sarah should lift Thomas to a sitting position. The medicine woman then spread the paste across his chest, the pungent smell making Sarah's eyes water. Finally, she produced a small clay cup filled with a steaming liquid. "She says he must drink this," Makya translated from the doorway. "And it will help clear his lungs." Sarah nodded, cradling Thomas's head as Nahimana carefully tipped the liquid between his pale lips. Some dribbled down his chin, but the boy swallowed reflexively. Almost immediately, he began to cough. Deep, racking coughs that shook his small frame. Sarah looked up in alarm, but Nahimana nodded approvingly. "Good," she said in heavily accented English, surprising Sarah. "Well, water come out." Indeed, Thomas was expelling fluid with each cough, his breathing becoming less labored as his lungs cleared. After several minutes, the coughing subsided, and he lay exhausted in his mother's arms, but his color looked better, his breathing more regular. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the old woman. "Thank you." Nahimana touched Sarah's shoulder briefly, then turned to prepare more medicine, this time for Lily's ankle. Outside, James, Emma, and Michael had been settled near the central fire, wrapped in blankets and sipping pine needle tea. Lily had been brought to Nahimana's wickiup for treatment, her ankle now carefully wrapped in a poultice secured with strips of soft hide. Makya's grandfather, White Hawk, sat across from the children, his weathered face impassive as he watched them. The other villagers moved about their evening tasks, occasionally glancing at the white children with a mixture of curiosity and reserve. "Your mother is with your brothers," Makya told James and Emma as he joined them by the fire. "They are being cared for," James nodded, his young face solemn beyond his years. "Will Thomas be all right?" Makya considered the question carefully. Among his people, it was considered bad luck to make definitive statements about healing. The spirits might hear and take offense. "Nahimana is very wise," he said instead. "She has healed many who were touched by the water spirits." Emma leaned against her brother, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion. "I'm sorry we went too close to the river," she murmured. "Mama told us not to, but it looked so pretty with all the flowers growing on the bank." Makya's expression remained neutral, but inwardly he felt a pang of sympathy. Children were the same everywhere, drawn to beauty, heedless of danger. His own sister had nearly drowned as a child, captivated by the bright feathers of a bird nesting near the river's edge. "The river rose very quickly," he said. "And even experienced hunters can be surprised by flash floods." James looked up at him, his blue eyes serious in his mud-streaked face. "You saved us, all of us. Why?" The question startled Makya. It was not something that had occurred to him to consider. "Why would I not?" he replied simply. "Because we're white," James said bluntly. "I've heard people in town say that Indians hate white folks. That you'd rather see us all dead." Makya was silent for a long moment, weighing his response. The boy deserved honesty, but there were complexities here that a child could not fully grasp. The broken treaties, the stolen lands, the massacres on both sides that had poisoned relations between their peoples. "Some of my people do hate whites," he acknowledged finally, "just as some whites hate the Apache, but hatred is a choice. I choose differently." He paused, adding more wood to the fire. "Besides, you are children. Children are sacred to the Apache, no matter the color of their skin. Papa said we should judge people by their actions, not by stories others tell about them," James said, his voice small. "I think he would have liked you, Mr. Makya." Something tightened in Makya's chest, an unexpected emotion he couldn't quite name. "Your father was wise," he said quietly. White Hawk, who had been listening to this exchange, spoke suddenly in Apache. "The boy has an old soul," he commented, studying James with renewed interest. "He sees with clear eyes." Makya nodded in agreement, but did not translate. Some conversations were best kept between the Apache. Sarah emerged from Nahimana's wickiup with Thomas in her arms, the boy still unconscious, but breathing more easily. Lily limped beside her, leaning on the medicine woman for support. Relief washed over Sarah's face as she saw her other children safe by the fire. "Thomas is resting," she told James and Emma as she joined them. "Nahimana says he should wake by morning." She settled on a woven mat that someone had placed near the fire, arranging Thomas carefully on her lap. Lily sat beside her, leaning against her mother's shoulder. Mama, they gave us tea," Emma said, her voice heavy with oncoming sleep. "It tastes like Christmas." Sarah smiled, stroking her daughter's tangled red hair. "That was very kind of them." White Hawk rose from his place by the fire and approached Sarah. Though he was not a tall man, his presence commanded respect. He spoke directly to her in Apache, his voice deep and resonant. "My grandfather welcomes you to our fire," Makya translated. "He says that tonight you and your children are under the protection of the Ndi, the Apache people. No harm will come to you here." Sarah met the elder's gaze steadily. "Please tell him that we are honored by his hospitality and protection. My children and I owe your people our lives." After Makya translated, White Hawk nodded once, his expression softening slightly. He spoke again, more briefly this time. "He says you should rest now," Makya relayed. "Morning comes quickly, and your strength must be renewed." With that, the old man turned and walked away, disappearing into the largest wickiup at the center of the village. Other Apache began to retire as well, returning to their dwellings until only a few remained at the central fire, those assigned to tend it through the night, and Makya himself. "Will you be in trouble?" Sarah asked him quietly, once they were relatively alone. "For bringing us here?" Makya looked at her, surprised by her perception. "Not trouble," he said after a moment, "but there will be questions, discussions in the council." "I don't want to cause problems for you," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "You've done so much already." He shook his head slightly. It was the right thing to do. My grandfather understands this, even if some others may not. He paused, then added, "Rest now. Your children need you strong." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had been held at bay by fear and adrenaline. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, her body leaden with fatigue. She arranged her children around her like a protective circle, Thomas and Michael on her lap, Emma and Lily curled against her sides, James sitting protectively beside them all. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Makya's silhouette against the fire, his profile strong and watchful in the flickering light. In that moment, despite the strangeness of her surroundings and the trauma of the day's events, Sarah Blackwood felt safer than she had since Thomas's death had left her alone in a hostile wilderness. Dawn broke over the Apache village with a gentle insistence, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the branches of cottonwood trees that stood sentinel along the nearby stream. Sarah awoke slowly, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, until memory rushed back. The flood, the desperate search, the miraculous rescue of her children. They still slept around her, their faces peaceful in repose, unburdened for these few precious moments by the trauma they had endured. Thomas stirred in her lap, and Sarah's heart leaped. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing confused blue eyes that darted around before settling on her face. "Mama," his voice was a hoarse whisper, raw from the water that had filled his lungs and the coughing that had expelled it. "I'm here, my darling," Sarah whispered, tears of relief springing to her eyes. "You're safe now." Thomas frowned, taking in their surroundings, the dying embers of the fire, the unfamiliar dwellings, the strange patterns on the blankets that covered them. "Where are we?" "With friends," Sarah said simply, deciding that a more detailed explanation could wait until he was stronger. "How do you feel?" "My chest hurts," Thomas admitted, touching the front of the buckskin shirt he now wore. "And I'm thirsty." A shadow fell across them, and Sarah looked up to find Nahimana standing there, a wooden cup in her gnarled hands. The old medicine woman nodded approvingly at Thomas's conscious state and knelt beside them, offering the cup. "Drink," she said in her accented English. "Good for chest pain." Sarah helped Thomas sit up, supporting his back as he sipped the liquid. He grimaced at the bitter taste, but continued to drink under Nahimana's watchful eye. "Thank you," Sarah said when Thomas had finished. "A day for everything you've done." Nahimana inclined her head slightly, then reached out to touch Thomas's forehead. "Fever gone. Good." She rose with surprising agility for her age and walked away, disappearing into her wickiup. The other children began to wake, each processing their surroundings with varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. Lily's ankle still pained her, but the swelling had reduced significantly overnight. Emma clung to Sarah's skirts, wide-eyed as she watched Apache women begin their morning tasks. James, ever practical, immediately checked on his siblings, relief evident in his young face when he confirmed they were all present and recovering. Michael, the youngest of two, seemed the least affected by their ordeal. Too young to fully comprehend the danger they had faced, he toddled about, fascinated by the colorful woven blankets and the dogs that lounged at the edges of the camp. "Stay close, Michael," Sarah cautioned, though she noticed that the Apache women kept a watchful eye on her youngest, one occasionally redirecting him with gentle hands when he strayed too far. Makya appeared as they were finishing a breakfast of corn cakes and honey provided by the village women. He looked tired but composed, his long hair freshly braided, his buckskin shirt replaced with a clean one. Sarah realized he must have been awake through the night, guarding them. "Your children look better this morning," he observed, crouching down to their level. "And the color has returned to their faces, thanks to you and your people," Sarah said, the depth of her gratitude evident in her voice. "I don't know how I can ever repay such kindness." Makya's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his dark eyes, perhaps discomfort at her gratitude, or perhaps something else entirely. "There is no debt," he said. "The Apache do not keep ledgers of kindness." He turned his attention to Thomas, who was watching him with unconcealed curiosity. "You are very brave," Makya told the boy. "The river spirits are strong, but you are stronger." Thomas's pale face flushed with pleasure at the praise. "Did you really pull me out of the water, sir?" "I found you on the shore," Makya corrected gently. "The river itself must have placed you there, tiring of your struggle against it." This explanation seemed to satisfy Thomas, who nodded solemnly. "Papa said the land here has its own spirit, that we should respect it, or it would remind us who was here first." Sarah felt a pang at the mention of her late husband. Thomas had spoken truly. Those had been Thomas Blackwood's exact words when they first settled on their small plot of land. He had been unusual among the white settlers, viewing the natural world not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood and respected. "Your papa was a wise man," Makya said, his voice softening slightly. A commotion at the edge of the village interrupted their conversation. A group of Apache men had returned from what appeared to be a hunting expedition, leading horses laden with game. Among them was a tall, muscular warrior whose face darkened visibly when he spotted the white family at the central fire. He strode toward them, his body language radiating hostility. Sarah instinctively gathered her children closer, recognizing danger when she saw it. Makya rose smoothly to his feet, positioning himself between Sarah's family and the approaching warrior. The two men exchanged rapid words in Apache, their tones growing increasingly heated. Others began to gather, drawn by the tension that crackled in the morning air. "What's happening?" James whispered, his arm protectively around Emma. "I'm not sure," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady for her children's sake. Whitehawk emerged from his wickiup, his presence immediately commanding attention. He spoke a single word that cut through the argument like a knife, silencing both men. The hostile warrior glanced at Sarah and her children, his expression contemptuous, before turning on his heel and stalking away. Makya's posture remained rigid for several moments before he visibly forced himself to relax. He turned back to Sarah, his face once again composed. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said formally. "Nakohe has strong feelings about white settlers." "I understand," Sarah said quietly, though her heart still raced. "Many of your people must share his views." Makya considered this, then nodded once. "Some do. But my grandfather is chief here, and he has welcomed you. No one will challenge his decision openly." The unspoken but hung in the air between them. Sarah was no stranger to the complexities of frontier politics. She knew that Whitehawk had put himself in a difficult position by sheltering her family, just as Makya had by bringing them here in the first place. "We should return to our home as soon as possible," she said, making a decision. "The children are stronger today. If you could point us in the right direction." "No," Makya interrupted, his tone firmer than she had yet heard from him. "Thomas is still weak. Lily cannot walk far on her injured ankle, and—" He hesitated, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "The flood may have damaged your homestead. It would be wise to know what awaits you before you return." Sarah hadn't considered this possibility, though now it seemed obvious. The same raging waters that had nearly claimed her children could easily have destroyed her small cabin and the surrounding fields she had worked so hard to cultivate. "I will go to your homestead today," Makya continued. "I will see what remains and bring back what can be salvaged." "Alone?" Sarah asked, surprised by the offer. A ghost of a smile touched Makya's lips. "I am accustomed to traveling alone. It is the way of Apache hunters." White Hawk approached them, his lined face solemn but not unkind. He spoke to Makya, who listened respectfully before responding. The old chief's gaze settled on Sarah and her children, assessing them with eyes that had seen decades of conflict between their peoples. "My grandfather says you and your children should rest today," Makya translated. "He has instructed Nahimana to continue caring for Thomas and Lily. I will go to your homestead and return before sunset." Sarah wanted to protest, to insist that she should be the one to check on her property, but pragmatism overrode pride. Her children needed her here, and in truth, she was still exhausted from the previous day's ordeal. "Please thank your grandfather for his generosity," she said, inclining her head respectfully toward White Hawk. "And thank you, Makya, for offering to do this. My homestead is about 5 miles east of where you found us, on the other side of Juniper Ridge. There's a small creek that runs behind the cabin." Makya nodded. "I know the place. I have passed it many times while hunting." This revelation surprised Sarah. The idea that this man had been near her home, perhaps watching from a distance, was unsettling yet somehow reassuring. He had known of her family's existence long before yesterday's catastrophe. White Hawk spoke again, addressing Sarah directly this time, his weathered hand gesturing toward her children. "He says your children are welcome to play with the children of our village," Makya translated, a note of surprise in his voice. "He says it will help them forget their fear of the river." Sarah looked around and noticed for the first time the Apache children watching them curiously from a respectful distance. Boys and girls of various ages, their dark eyes filled with the universal childhood mixture of wariness and interest. "That's very kind," she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I think they would like that." Emma, who had been listening intently despite her young age, looked up hopefully. "Can I really play with them, Mama?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's tangled red hair. "If you're invited, yes, but be on your best behavior. We are guests here." Makya spoke to the watching Apache children, who broke into smiles at whatever he told them. A girl about Emma's age approached cautiously, holding out a small doll made of corn husks. She said something in a soft voice, her eyes fixed on Emma's face. "She is offering to show Emma how to make a doll like hers," Makya explained. "Her name is Tallulah." Emma looked at the doll with fascination. "It's beautiful," she said, smiling at Tallulah. "Thank you." Though the Apache girl couldn't understand the English words, she clearly recognized the acceptance in Emma's tone. She smiled back, revealing a missing front tooth, and gestured for Emma to follow her. "Go ahead," Sarah encouraged, "but stay where I can see you." As Emma tentatively joined Tallulah, other Apache children gradually approached. A boy about James's age offered to show him how to use a small bow, while 2 girls closer to Lily's age brought her colorful beads to string while she rested her injured ankle. Even Michael found a playmate in a chubby Apache toddler who offered to share a wooden toy horse. Within minutes, the sounds of children's laughter, a universal language that needed no translation, filled the morning air. Sarah watched, amazed at how quickly the barriers of language and culture dissolved between the children. They adapted to their differences with an ease that adults had long forgotten, finding common ground in play and curiosity. Children see with clearer eyes than we do, Makia observed, following her gaze. They have not yet learned to fear what is different. No, Sarah agreed softly. That is something we teach them. She looked up at him, really seeing him for perhaps the first time since he had pulled her from the river. In the morning light, the strong planes of his face were softened, revealing a man perhaps younger than she had initially thought, mid-30s at most, with eyes that held both strength and a surprising gentleness. "Thank you again," she said quietly. "Not just for saving us, but for this." She gestured to her children, now happily engaged with their new friends, for giving them a memory of kindness to balance the memory of fear. Makia seemed momentarily at a loss for words, unaccustomed to such direct gratitude. He finally nodded, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I should prepare for the journey to your homestead," he said, changing the subject. "Is there anything specific you wish me to look for, if it still stands?" Sarah thought of her humble cabin, of the few precious possessions she had managed to bring with her to this frontier life. "There's a wooden box beneath my bed," she said. "It contains letters from my husband and a small portrait of him with the children, if nothing else. And that box matters most." "I will find it if it can be found," Makia promised, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away, moving toward the horses tethered at the edge of the village. Sarah watched him go, a curious feeling settling in her chest, something between gratitude and something else she wasn't ready to name. Instead, she turned her attention back to her children, who for the first time since Thomas's death were playing with the simple joy of being alive, their differences forgotten in the universal language of childhood. The sun had climbed high in the Arizona sky by the time Makia reached Sarah Blackwood's homestead, or what remained of it. He reined in his dun-colored stallion on the ridge above the property, his expression betraying nothing as he surveyed the devastation below. The cabin still stood, which was something of a miracle given the force of the flood that had swept through the valley, but it listed dangerously to one side, its foundation undermined by the rushing water. The small barn had not been so fortunate. Only its stone foundation remained, the wooden structure entirely washed away. The chicken coop was gone, the garden destroyed, the carefully tended fields of corn and beans transformed into a muddy wasteland littered with debris. Makia dismounted, tethering his horse to a juniper tree before making his way down the slope. The ground was still soft and treacherous, forcing him to pick his path carefully. As he neared the cabin, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. Small footprints preserved in the mud, leading from the cabin to the river's edge. The children's tracks, made just before the flood had overtaken them. Beside them were larger prints, Sarah's, following frantically behind. He paused, kneeling to touch one of the small footprints. Emma's, he guessed, or perhaps Lily's. It struck him then, the fragility of human life. How easily these children might have vanished from the earth, their existence reduced to nothing more than footprints in mud that would soon be erased by sun and wind. Rising, Makia continued to the cabin, testing the tilting porch with his weight before deciding it would hold. The door hung askew on broken hinges. Inside, chaos reigned. Furniture had been overturned by the force of the water that had invaded the home. A layer of silt covered everything, and the smell of river mud permeated the small space. Makia moved methodically through the cabin, righting what furniture could be salvaged, gathering clothing and blankets that could be cleaned and reused. He found a small trunk that seemed relatively undamaged and began filling it with items he judged important. A few books, though their pages were warped from moisture, cooking utensils, a child's wooden toy soldier, a hairbrush with strands of blonde hair still caught in the bristles. Beneath the overturned bed, he found what Sarah had asked for, the wooden box containing her husband's letters. It had been sealed well enough that the contents appeared largely undamaged. Makia added it to the trunk without opening it, respecting the privacy of her memories. As he worked, Makia's thoughts turned to the woman herself. Sarah Blackwood was not what he had expected from a white settler. There was a quiet dignity in her that reminded him of the women of his own tribe, a strength born not of bravado, but of survival. He had seen how fiercely she protected her children, how she had been willing to sacrifice herself to save them. Such maternal courage transcended the barriers of race and culture, and her children, they had shown a resilience that impressed him. James with his solemn responsibility, Lily with her stoic endurance of pain, Emma with her quick smile despite her fear, Thomas with his fight against the river spirits, and little Michael with his innocent acceptance of their strange surroundings. They were good children, well taught by their mother. Makia was securing the trunk to his horse when he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching riders. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt as he turned to face the potential threat. 3 men on horseback appeared on the ridge he had descended earlier. White men, one in the blue uniform of a cavalry officer, the others in the rough clothing of frontier settlers. They halted abruptly at the sight of him, the civilians reaching for their rifles. "Hold!" the officer commanded, raising a hand to stay his companions. He urged his horse forward, stopping a respectful distance from Makia. "You there, Apache? What are you doing at the Blackwood place?" Makia stood his ground, his posture relaxed but alert. "I am gathering belongings for the widow Blackwood and her children," he replied in clear English, his voice steady. The officer's eyebrows rose in surprise, both at the Apache's fluent English and at his statement. "Sarah and the children. You've seen them." "There was a flash flood yesterday. We've been searching for survivors along the river. They are safe," Makia confirmed. "I found them during the flood and took them to my village for shelter. The children were injured but are recovering." The 2 civilians exchanged uneasy glances. "Your village?" one of them repeated, suspicion evident in his tone. "You're saying Sarah and those kids are with the Apache?" "Willingly? Where else should they go?" Makia asked simply, gesturing to the damaged cabin. "Their home is not safe." The officer studied Makia thoughtfully. "I'm Lieutenant Parker from Fort Benton," he introduced himself. "These men are from the settlement. When Sarah and the children didn't come to town for supplies as expected, and then with reports of the flood." He paused. "We feared the worst. The children were caught in the flood," Makia explained. "I was able to reach them in time." Lieutenant Parker dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. "You saved them, all 5. Makia nodded once. The boy Thomas was the most difficult to find. He had swallowed much water, but our medicine woman helped draw it from his lungs. The lieutenant removed his hat, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "That's remarkable. And you say they're at your village now? Are they free to leave?" "Of course," Makia replied, an edge entering his voice. "They are guests, not prisoners. Mrs. Blackwood chose to stay until her children were stronger. I offered to check her homestead and bring back what could be salvaged." He gestured to the trunk secured to his horse. Lieutenant Parker approached the cabin, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. "This structure isn't safe," he concluded. "The foundation's been compromised. One good wind could bring it down entirely." "I will tell her," Makia said. As she suspected as much. The lieutenant turned back to him, curiosity evident in his expression. You speak excellent English. Were you educated at one of the mission schools? No, Makia replied. I learned while scouting for the army, before the last treaty. Recognition flickered in Parker's eyes. You're Makia, aren't you? I've heard of you. You guided Captain Reynolds' expedition through the mountains 3 years ago. Makia inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Well then, Parker said, making a decision. We'll escort you back to your village. Mrs. Blackwood will need transportation for herself and her children, and we can offer assistance in rebuilding if she chooses to remain in the territory. The two civilians looked uncomfortable with this plan, but neither voiced an objection to their superior officer. As you wish, Makia said, though inwardly he felt a twinge of concern. The presence of soldiers in the village would not be welcomed by many, particularly Nakohe, who already resented the White family's presence. Give us a few minutes to check the rest of the property, Parker requested. We should make sure there's nothing else worth salvaging before we leave. Makia nodded and waited as the men conducted a thorough inspection of the damaged homestead. They managed to recover a few additional items, a small box of ammunition, some tools from what remained of the barn, a water-damaged Bible that might dry out enough to be readable again. As they prepared to depart, Lieutenant Parker approached Makia once more. It was a good thing you did, he said quietly, saving those children. Not many would have risked themselves that way. Makia met his gaze steadily. I did what any man would do. No, Parker contradicted him, shaking his head slightly. Not any man. I've seen too much of this frontier to believe that. He paused. There's been too much bloodshed between our peoples, too many atrocities on both sides. It's refreshing to witness an act of simple humanity. Makia didn't respond. Such conversations made him uncomfortable. He hadn't saved the Blackwood family to make a political statement or to bridge the divide between their cultures. He had simply acted as his conscience dictated. The journey back to the Apache village was tense, the soldiers and settlers maintaining a wary distance from Makia as they rode. Conversation was minimal, limited to practical observations about the trail and the weather. Makia was acutely aware of the potential consequences of bringing armed white men into his grandfather's camp, but he saw no alternative that wouldn't raise suspicion about the Blackwoods' situation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally approached the village. Makia rode slightly ahead, calling out in Apache to announce their arrival and explain the presence of the soldiers. Warriors emerged from the wickiups, hands near their weapons, but not drawing them. Women gathered the children, including the Blackwood children, moving them toward the center of the camp. Sarah stood from where she had been sitting with Nahimana, her face registering surprise and then concern at the sight of the military escort. She quickly scanned the group until she found Makia, relief evident in her expression when she confirmed he was unharmed. Lieutenant Parker, she acknowledged as the officer dismounted. This is unexpected. Mrs. Blackwood, Parker greeted her with a respectful tip of his hat. We were searching for survivors from the flood when we encountered your Apache friend at your homestead. He informed us of your situation. Sarah glanced at Makia, who had dismounted and was untying the trunk from his horse. Makia saved my children's lives, she said firmly. And Chief Whitehawk's people have shown us nothing but kindness and hospitality. So I understand, Parker replied, his tone carefully neutral. Nevertheless, we've come to offer you and your children transport back to the settlement. I regret to inform you that your cabin suffered significant damage in the flood. It's not structurally sound. Sarah's face fell at this news, though she had clearly been prepared for it. "I see." "And the rest of the property? The barn is gone," Makia said, approaching with the trunk. "The fields are washed out, but this—" He indicated the trunk. "And some tools were saved. And this—" He reached inside his shirt and withdrew the wooden box she had specifically requested. Sarah took it with trembling hands, pressing it briefly to her chest before tucking it securely under her arm. "Thank you," she whispered. White Hawk emerged from his wickiup, his regal bearing commanding immediate attention despite his advanced age. Lieutenant Parker straightened instinctively, recognizing authority when he saw it. "Chief White Hawk," he greeted the elder respectfully. "I'm Lieutenant Parker from Fort Benton. I've come to assist Mrs. Blackwood and her children," Makia translated, and White Hawk responded with a measured dignity. "My grandfather welcomes you, as long as you come in peace," Makia relayed. "He says the Blackwood family has been under our protection and will remain so until they choose to leave." Parker nodded. "Please convey my thanks for the care shown to American citizens in distress. The Army appreciates such neighborly actions." As Makia translated, Sarah moved closer to her children, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. James stood protectively near his siblings, his young face serious. "Mama," Emma said, tugging at Sarah's skirt. "Do we have to go? Tallulah was going to show me how to make a necklace tomorrow." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, smoothing her hair. "Our home was damaged in the flood, sweetheart. We need to find a new place to stay." "But why can't we stay here?" Lily asked, her ankle still wrapped in Nahimana's herbal poultice. "Everyone has been so nice." Sarah glanced up at Makia, their eyes meeting briefly. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the unexpected connection that had formed, a recognition that their worlds, so separate before, had now irrevocably overlapped. "It's complicated, Lily," Sarah said finally, returning her attention to her children. "The Apache have their own lives, their own ways. We can't impose on their kindness indefinitely." "But Mr. Makia," Thomas began, his voice still raspy from his ordeal, "has done more than enough for us already," Sarah finished gently. She rose, facing Lieutenant Parker once more. "We're grateful for the offer of transport, Lieutenant, but my children are still recovering, especially Thomas. I would prefer to leave in the morning, if that's acceptable. One more night of rest would benefit them greatly." Parker hesitated, glancing at the Apache gathered around them, their expressions ranging from neutral to openly hostile. "I'm not sure that's advisable, Mrs. Blackwood. We should return to the fort before nightfall." "I assure you, we're in no danger here," Sarah insisted, a surprising steel entering her voice. "If Chief White Hawk is willing to extend his hospitality for one more night, I would prefer to accept it. For my children's sake." Makia translated her request to his grandfather, who nodded his assent after a brief consideration. "The chief agrees," Makia informed Parker. "He invites you and your men to share our fire tonight as well." The lieutenant looked taken aback by the invitation. After a moment's thought, he nodded. "We accept with gratitude. It will give us an opportunity to better understand our neighbors." White Hawk's weathered face remained impassive, but Makia detected a glint of approval in his grandfather's eyes. It was a small gesture, extending hospitality to the soldiers, but it represented a significant step toward the peaceful coexistence the old chief had long advocated for. As the Apache women began preparing the evening meal and the soldiers awkwardly dismounted, unsure of the protocols in this unfamiliar setting, Sarah moved to stand beside Makia. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "My homestead." Makia considered softening the truth, but decided she deserved honesty. Bad, he admitted. The cabin stands, but not for long, I think. The fields will need much work before they can grow food again. Sarah nodded, accepting this assessment with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout their acquaintance. I suspected as much when I saw how high the water had risen. She sighed, watching her children as they tentatively resumed their play with the Apache children, the earlier interruption already forgotten in the resilient way of the young. "Do you have choices?" Makia said after a moment. "The settlement, perhaps, or the army might provide assistance." "Yes," Sarah agreed, though there was a hesitation in her voice that caught his attention. "Choices." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. Their eyes met again, and Makia found himself unexpectedly affected by the quiet strength he saw there, by the dignity with which she faced this latest challenge in a life that had clearly dealt her more than her share of hardship. Before either could speak further, Lieutenant Parker approached, breaking the moment. "Mrs. Blackwood, if I might have a word about arrangements for tomorrow." Sarah nodded, offering Makia a small smile before turning away. "As of course, Lieutenant." Makia watched her go, a curious sensation settling in his chest, something between admiration and a more complicated emotion he wasn't prepared to name. Whatever it was, he recognized that the flood had washed away more than just Sarah Blackwood's homestead. It had eroded something of the careful distance he had maintained from the white settlers, leaving him standing on unfamiliar ground. The evening descended upon the Apache village in a symphony of deepening colors, indigo bleeding into the last streaks of amber as the sun surrendered to the night. Stars emerged like scattered silver against the darkening canvas of sky, more brilliant here than Sarah had ever seen them back east. The air cooled rapidly, a characteristic of the desert that still surprised her after nearly 2 years on the frontier. Around the central fire, an uneasy gathering had formed. Apache warriors sat cross-legged on one side, their faces impassive in the dancing firelight. Lieutenant Parker and his men occupied the opposite side, their military posture slightly softened by the informal setting, but still noticeably rigid. Between these two worlds, bridging the divide like stepping stones across a stream, sat Sarah and her children, White Hawk and Makia. The Apache women had prepared a simple but abundant meal: venison stew, corn cakes, and wild berries gathered from the foothills. They served everyone with quiet efficiency before retreating to the edges of the gathering, watching with guarded curiosity as the white soldiers awkwardly attempted to eat with their fingers as the Apache did. Nagohi, the warrior who had confronted Makia earlier, sat slightly apart, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as they fixed periodically on the soldiers with undisguised hostility. Sarah noticed how Makia positioned himself subtly between Nakohe and her family, a silent guardian against potential trouble. Thomas, still weak but improving steadily, leaned against Sarah's side, his eyes heavy with the exhaustion that follows healing. Lily sat nearby, her injured ankle extended carefully before her, while Emma and Michael had already fallen asleep on a pile of soft furs provided by the Apache women. Only James remained fully alert, his young face solemn as he observed the adults around the fire, missing nothing. Lieutenant Parker cleared his throat, breaking the prolonged silence. "Chief Whitehawk," he began, waiting for Makia to translate, "on behalf of the United States Army, I extend our gratitude for your tribe's assistance to Mrs. Blackwood and her children. Such acts of humanity are to be commended." White Hawk listened to Makia's translation, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he responded, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience, of witnessed promises and betrayals. So my grandfather says that children are sacred to the Apache, Makia translated. The river does not ask if a child is Apache or white before it tries to claim them. Neither did we ask before offering help. Parker nodded, clearly searching for the appropriate response. A noble sentiment, he finally said, if only such wisdom were more common on both sides. One of the settlers who had accompanied Parker shifted uncomfortably. Begging your pardon, Lieutenant, but let's not forget the Miller family. Their children weren't spared when their homestead was raided last spring. A ripple of tension passed through the Apache warriors. Makia's expression hardened, but he translated the comment faithfully for his grandfather. Whitehawk's response was measured but firm. My grandfather says that the men who attacked the Miller place were not from our band. They were young men from the southern mountains, angry about the new mining camp that poisoned their water. He says their actions were wrong, but their anger was born of many broken promises. Sarah watched this exchange with growing concern. The fragile peace of the evening was balanced on a knife's edge. Decades of grievances threatening to spill over into open hostility. She glanced at her sleeping children, suddenly acutely aware of their vulnerability should the situation deteriorate. Lieutenant Parker must have sensed the same danger. Perhaps we should focus on the present, he suggested diplomatically. Mrs. Blackwood's situation requires immediate attention. With her homestead damaged beyond repair, arrangements must be made. Sarah straightened, recognizing her cue. Yes, about that, Lieutenant. I've been giving it considerable thought. She paused, gathering her courage. I don't wish to return to the settlement. Parker's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mrs. Blackwood, with all due respect, what alternative do you propose? Surely you don't intend to rebuild your homestead alone, and the fort has limited accommodations for civilians. I know, Sarah acknowledged, but the settlement holds nothing for me. No family, few friends. Just memories of Thomas and the life we tried to build. She took a deep breath. I've decided to return east to my sister in Pennsylvania. She wrote after Thomas died, offering us a home. I declined then, too proud or perhaps too stubborn to admit defeat. But now, she glanced at her sleeping children, now I see that my pride is less important than their security. Makia translated this for Whitehawk, whose expression softened almost imperceptibly as he regarded Sarah with new respect. A wise decision, Parker said, nodding slowly. The frontier is no place for a widow with young children, despite your admirable fortitude, Mrs. Blackwood. We can arrange military transport to the railhead at Fort Craig. From there, you can take the train eastward. Thank you, Lieutenant. That's very generous. Sarah hesitated, then added, but there's something else I'd like to request, if possible. Of course. Sarah turned slightly, meeting Makia's dark eyes. I'd like to ask Makia to guide us to Fort Craig. My children trust him, and after all we've been through. She let the sentence hang unfinished. Makia's expression revealed nothing, but Sarah detected a subtle shift in his posture, surprise, perhaps, or something more complex. Parker frowned. That's highly irregular, Mrs. Blackwood. The Army provides escorts for civilian travelers through dangerous territories. I understand, Sarah acknowledged, but these past days have been traumatic for my children. Makia is familiar to them now, a source of security. She paused. Please, Lieutenant, after what they've endured, I'd like to spare them any additional distress. Parker glanced between Sarah and Makia, clearly processing the unusual request. I suppose it could be arranged, if Chief Whitehawk is agreeable and Makia is willing. He looked to the Apache hunter expectantly. Makia translated the request to his grandfather, their conversation more extended than the simple relay of information. Whitehawk's gaze was penetrating as he studied first his grandson, then Sarah, as though reading currents invisible to others. Finally, Makia turned back to Parker. "My grandfather gives his permission. I will guide Mrs. Blackwood and her children to Fort Craig, if that is her wish." "It is," Sarah confirmed quietly, a weight seemingly lifting from her shoulders. James, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Are we really leaving Arizona, Mama? Going back east?" Sarah reached out to smooth his tousled blonde hair. "Yes, James. We're going to live with Aunt Rebecca. You remember her from when you were smaller, don't you? She has that big house with the apple orchard." "But what about our home?" James persisted. "Papa built it for us." Sarah's expression softened with both sadness and resolve. "Sometimes, James, home isn't a place. It's the people we love. Your papa would understand that. He would want us to be safe and happy, even if that means leaving the home he built." James considered this with the solemn thoughtfulness that made him seem older than his 8 years. "Will Mr. Makia come with us all the way to Pennsylvania?" A flash of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed Makia's face. "No, James," he answered before Sarah could. "My place is here with my people. I will see you safely to Fort Craig, but then I must return." The boy's face fell, but he nodded with the resignation of a child who has learned too early that life brings partings. "I understand." An unexpected voice joined the conversation. "The boy has grown attached to you, Hunter." It was Nakohe, speaking in English for the first time that evening, his tone less hostile than before. "As children do, without thought for the boundaries adults have drawn." Makia regarded the warrior with surprise. "You speak English well." Nakohe's smile was without warmth. "I spent 2 years at the mission school before I escaped. They were very determined that I should abandon my savage tongue." His gaze shifted to James. "Children see differently than we do. It is both their gift and their weakness." Whitehawk spoke then, his voice carrying the quiet authority of age and wisdom. Makia translated, though Sarah suspected that several of the Apache present, including Nakohe, understood more English than they revealed. "My grandfather says that tomorrow's journey should wait until tomorrow's sun. Tonight is for rest and gratitude. He invites the soldiers to share stories of their travels, as is our custom when strangers eat at our fire." Lieutenant Parker seemed taken aback by this invitation but recovered quickly. "We would be honored," he said, nodding respectfully to the old chief. "Though I fear our stories may not match the eloquence of Apache tales." Whitehawk's weathered face creased in what might have been a suppressed smile. "My grandfather says that a true story, simply told, needs no adornment." And so the night progressed, the initial tension gradually easing as stories were exchanged across the cultural divide. Lieutenant Parker spoke of his childhood in Vermont, of green mountains so different from Arizona's stark beauty. One of the settlers, warming to the unusual gathering, described his journey west by wagon train, the hardships and wonders encountered along the way. The Apache contributed their own tales, a hunting expedition that led to an unexpected encounter with a mountain lion, the discovery of a hidden valley blooming with rare desert flowers after an unusually wet spring. These stories were simpler in their telling, but rich with the Apache's deep connection to the land that sustained them. Throughout the evening, Sarah found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Makia as he moved between languages, between worlds. There was a quiet dignity in how he carried himself, neither fully embracing the white men's ways nor rejecting them outright. He existed in the borderlands between cultures, fluent in both, but perhaps never entirely at home in either. As the fire burned lower and the stories wound down, Thomas stirred against Sarah's side, opening drowsy eyes. "Mama," he murmured, just loudly enough for those nearest to hear. "When we go with Mr. Makia tomorrow, can I ride on his horse?" He promised to show me how Apache boys learn to ride. Sarah glanced at Makia, who met her eyes across the fire. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the peculiar intimacy that can form between strangers thrown together by crisis, of boundaries crossed that could never be re-established. "If Mr. Makia is willing, and if you're strong enough," she told Thomas, her voice soft. "Indeed, I am willing," Makia confirmed, his usually stoic expression warming slightly, "but only if Nahimana agrees that you are recovered enough for such an adventure." Thomas's face brightened with hope. "I'll ask her first thing in the morning," he promised, settling back against his mother with a contented sigh. Lieutenant Parker observed this exchange with thoughtful eyes. "You've made quite an impression on the Blackwood children, Makia," he commented. "Not surprising, given the circumstances of your meeting. Children judge by actions, not by the color of skin or the language spoken," Makia replied, echoing Nakohi's earlier observation. "It is a wisdom adults would do well to remember." "Indeed," Parker agreed, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the bond that had clearly formed between the Apache hunter and the White family. "Well, tomorrow will be a long day. We should all get some rest." As the gathering began to disperse, Apache women appeared to guide the soldiers to shelters prepared for them at the edge of the village. Sarah gathered her sleeping younger children, James helping with Michael while she carried Emma. Lily hobbled alongside, her injured ankle much improved but still tender. Makia approached, Thomas half asleep in his arms. "The boy was falling asleep where he sat," he explained, his voice low. "I can carry him to your wiki-up." "Thank you," Sarah said, equally quietly. They walked in companionable silence through the village, the night sounds of the desert, a gentle backdrop to their footsteps. At the entrance to the small dwelling that had been provided for her family, Sarah paused. "Makia," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions the past days had stirred in her. "There is no need for words," he said, seeming to understand her difficulty. "And some things are beyond language." "Yes," she agreed, relieved. "But tomorrow, when we leave, there will be things that should be said." Makia's dark eyes reflected the starlight as he studied her face. "Tomorrow, then," he agreed, gently transferring the sleeping Thomas to her arms. His fingers brushed against hers in the process, a fleeting contact that nevertheless sent an unexpected warmth through her tired body. "Good night, Makia," Sarah whispered, suddenly conscious of James watching them with curious eyes. "Good night, Sarah Blackwood," he replied, using her name for the first time since they had met. Then he turned and walked away, his silhouette gradually dissolving into the darkness like a spirit returning to its own realm. Sarah ducked into the wiki-up, settling Thomas beside his siblings on the soft furs that had been arranged for them. As she tucked blankets around their sleeping forms, James spoke up, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. "Mama, do you think Mr. Makia could come visit us in Pennsylvania someday?" Sarah smoothed his hair, buying time as she considered how to answer. "That's a very long journey, James, and Makia's life is here with his people." "But he saved us," James persisted. "Doesn't that make us something to him?" "Yes," Sarah admitted softly, her heart aching with emotions she couldn't fully define. "I believe it does. But sometimes life separates people who matter to each other. That doesn't make the caring any less real." James was silent for a long moment, processing this adult complexity with a child's straightforward logic. "I'm going to write to him," he decided finally. "When we get to Aunt Rebecca's, I'll tell him all about Pennsylvania, so maybe someday he'll want to see it for himself." Sarah didn't have the heart to explain the improbability of this plan, the unlikelihood of mail reaching an Apache hunter, the cultural and social barriers that would make such a correspondence nearly impossible. Instead, she kissed her son's forehead. "That's a lovely thought, James. Now try to sleep. Tomorrow's journey begins early." As her children's breathing deepened into sleep around her, Sarah remained awake, her mind too full for rest. Through the smoke hole in the Wikiup's roof, she could see a patch of star-filled sky, so vast and indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath it. Somewhere in the village, Makia was perhaps looking at those same stars, separated from her by mere yards, but also by chasms of history and culture that seemed impossible to bridge. Yet he had reached across that divide to save her children, and in doing so, had saved her as well, not just from the raging river, but from the despair that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. For that, she owed him a debt that could never be repaid, a connection that could never be severed, regardless of the physical distance that would soon separate them. Dawn broke over the Apache village with the gentle persistence of time itself, rose-gold light spilling across the eastern horizon and gradually illuminating the Wikiups and the people already stirring around them. The morning air carried a crispness that would burn away once the sun climbed higher. But for now, it lent a clarity to the landscape that seemed almost painfully beautiful to Sarah as she stood outside the dwelling that had sheltered her family. This would be their last sunrise in this place, perhaps their last in Arizona territory altogether. By nightfall, they would be well on their way to Fort Craig, the first step in a journey that would carry them thousands of miles eastward, away from the harsh beauty of the desert and the memories, both painful and precious, that it contained. Sarah watched as her children helped the Apache women prepare a simple breakfast, their initial shyness long since evaporated. Emma chatted happily with Tallulah despite their limited shared vocabulary, while Lily helped grind corn for the morning meal, her injured ankle much improved after Nahimana's treatments. James and Thomas had been invited to help the men tend to the horses, an honor that had filled both boys with solemn pride. Even little Michael had found his place, toddling after the Apache children who had adopted him as a temporary playmate. They had adapted so quickly, Sarah marveled. Children's resilience never ceased to amaze her, their ability to find joy and connection in the most unexpected circumstances, to bridge divides that adults found insurmountable. They will miss this place. Sarah turned to find Makia standing nearby, his expression thoughtful as he followed her gaze to where the children worked and played alongside their Apache hosts. "Yes," she agreed softly. "They found something here that I couldn't give them alone." "Community," Makia suggested, "the knowledge that they are not alone in the world." Sarah nodded, surprising herself with the sudden sting of tears. "After Thomas died, I was so determined to prove that we could manage without help, that I could be mother and father both, that I could protect them from every danger." She laughed quietly, the sound hollow with self-recrimination. The flood rather thoroughly disproved that notion. "No one stands alone against nature," Makia said, his voice gentle despite its usual reserve. "Not even the Apache, who have lived with the desert's moods for generations." "I know that now," Sarah sighed, brushing away the threatening tears. "I just wish it hadn't taken nearly losing them to teach me the lesson." Makia was silent for a moment, his dark eyes reflective. "Some lessons can only be learned through fire or flood," he finally said. My grandfather says this is why the desert blooms after rain. It remembers the value of what was nearly lost. The analogy struck Sarah with unexpected force. She too had been transformed by the near loss of her children. Her perspectives shifted as dramatically as the landscape had been altered by the flood. What had once seemed paramount, maintaining her independence, proving her strength, now seemed almost trivial compared to the gift of her children's lives. "Your grandfather is very wise," she said. "I hope you'll thank him again for me before we leave, for everything." "You may thank him yourself," Makia replied. "He wishes to speak with you before our journey begins." Sarah glanced down at her simple dress, still showing the effects of her ordeal, despite the Apache women's efforts to clean it. "I'm hardly presentable for a formal audience." A ghost of a smile touched Makia's lips. "My grandfather cares little for such things. He sees with the heart, not the eyes." With that, he gestured for her to follow him through the village to Whitehawk's wickiup. The old chief sat outside on a woven mat, his face turned toward the rising sun as though absorbing its warmth into his aged bones. He looked up as they approached, his eyes, still sharp despite his years, settling on Sarah with a penetrating gaze that seemed to look through her rather than at her. Makia spoke softly in Apache, and Whitehawk nodded, gesturing for Sarah to sit across from him. She did so, folding her skirts beneath her as gracefully as she could manage. "My grandfather welcomes you to his fire, one last time," Makia translated, standing slightly behind Sarah. "He wishes to share words with you before you journey east." Whitehawk spoke then, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to being listened to with respect. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she recognized the gravity with which they were delivered. "He says that the river brought you to us for a purpose," Makia translated. "Not chance, but design. The old ones who watch over us sometimes arrange such meetings between peoples who have forgotten their common humanity." Sarah listened, touched by the chief's perspective on events that she had viewed primarily through the lens of fear and gratitude. "Indeed, he says that your children have reminded our children of laughter," Makia continued, "and that you have reminded the women of courage. These are gifts we will not forget. Please tell him that his people have given us far more than we could ever return," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "They've shown my children that kindness can cross any boundary, that humanity exists in unexpected places. It's a lesson I hope they'll carry with them always." As Makia translated, Whitehawk nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something that glinted in the morning light, a pendant on a leather cord. He held it out to Sarah. "This is turquoise," Makia explained, as Sarah accepted the gift with reverent hands. "Sacred to our people. It carries protection for travelers. My grandfather had his wife fashion this for you last night." Sarah examined the pendant, a small piece of blue-green stone polished to a soft sheen and wrapped in an intricate pattern of silver wire. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Please thank him. I'll treasure it always." Whitehawk spoke again, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face as Makia translated. "He says the stone is the color of life-giving water, and the silver represents the path that winds between worlds. May it remind you that not all boundaries are as fixed as they appear." The old chief's gaze shifted to Makia as he spoke a few additional words, too low for Sarah to hear clearly, even if she had understood the language. Whatever he said caused Makia's expression to shift subtly, a flash of something like discomfort quickly masked by his usual stoicism. Before Sarah could wonder at this exchange, Lieutenant Parker approached, his uniform immaculate despite their rustic surroundings. "Mrs. Blackwood, we should prepare to depart." The journey to Fort Craig will take at least 2 days, and we'll want to make good progress before the midday heat. Sarah nodded, rising to her feet with the turquoise pendant clutched in her palm. Of course, Lieutenant. We're nearly ready. She turned back to Whitehawk, offering a respectful nod that felt inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Thank you, Chief Whitehawk. For everything. The old man inclined his head in acknowledgement, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners in what might have been a smile. Then he spoke once more, a single phrase that Makia translated simply, "May your path lead you home." The preparations for departure moved swiftly after that. The soldiers had brought an extra horse for Sarah, and the Apache provided a travois that could be attached to Makia's mount to carry the smaller children when they tired. The trunk containing the salvaged belongings from the Blackwood homestead was secured to one of the soldiers' horses, along with bundles of food and water skins for the journey. The Apache women presented Sarah with a pack of additional provisions, dried meat, corn cakes, and herbal medicines prepared by Nahimana for the journey. There were also small gifts for each child, a miniature bow for James, a doll for Emma, made by Tallulah, a beaded bracelet for Lily, and tiny moccasins for Michael. For Thomas, there was a special gift, a small leather pouch containing stones and feathers that Nahimana explained would continue to strengthen his lungs after his ordeal in the river. The farewells were brief but heartfelt. Emma cried as she hugged Tallulah goodbye, while James solemnly shook hands with the Apache boys who had taught him to use a bow. Lily exchanged shy smiles with the women who had tended her injury, and Thomas pressed his small hand to his chest in the gesture of respect he had seen the Apache men use. As they mounted their horses, Sarah with Michael secured before her, James riding with a soldier, and Lily and Emma settled in the travois, Makia conferred quietly with Nakohe. The warrior who had initially been so hostile toward the white family now offered a grudging nod of respect, though his words remained for Makia alone. With final waves and calls of goodbye, the small procession moved away from the village, following a trail that wound through stands of juniper and across stretches of open desert. Lieutenant Parker and his men took the lead, with Makia riding slightly apart, his keen eyes constantly scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. Sarah found herself in the middle of the group, acutely aware of the shifting dynamics as they left Apache territory and entered the more ambiguous borderlands that separated reservations from white settlements. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. It was Thomas who finally broke the quiet, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "Mr. Makia, is it true that Apache boys can ride before they can walk?" Makia glanced back, a rare smile softening his features. "Not quite that young, Thomas, but we do learn to ride very early. By your age, most Apache boys can handle a horse alone. Papa was teaching me before he died," Thomas said matter-of-factly, with the directness children often bring to subjects adults find painful. "He said I had good hands for it." "Your father was right," Makia replied. "I saw how you held the reins earlier. Very steady." Thomas beamed at the praise. "When we get to Pennsylvania, do you think Aunt Rebecca will have horses I can ride?" Sarah intervened gently. "Aunt Rebecca lives in town, Thomas, but perhaps there will be riding academies where you can continue learning." "It won't be the same," Thomas said, his face falling. "I want to learn to ride like Mr. Makia, to track animals and read the signs in the desert." An uncomfortable silence followed this declaration, a reminder of the very different world they were heading toward. A world of brick buildings and paved streets, of social calls and piano lessons, where the skills Makia had mastered would have little relevance. The East has its own wisdom to teach, Makia said finally. Different trails to follow. You will learn new ways there, Thomas. But I don't want to forget the old ways, the boy persisted. Your ways. Sarah caught Makia's eye over her son's head, silently communicating her apology for placing him in this awkward position. He acknowledged her with a slight nod before turning his attention back to Thomas. The heart does not forget what matters, he told the boy. Even when the path leads far away, this seemed to satisfy Thomas, who settled back against his mother, his small face thoughtful. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. Emma's excited questions about the plants they passed, Lily's observations about the changing landscape, James's earnest inquiries about the soldiers' duties at Fort Craig. They stopped at midday in the shade of a rocky outcropping, dismounting to rest the horses and share a simple meal. As the soldiers arranged themselves at a slight distance, creating an informal perimeter around the rest stop, Sarah found herself seated beside Makia on a flat boulder, watching her children explore the immediate vicinity under Lieutenant Parker's watchful eye. They recover quickly, Makia observed, following her gaze. And already the flood becomes a memory rather than a present fear. Children live in the moment, Sarah agreed. It's both their blessing and their vulnerability. She fingered the turquoise pendant that now hung around her neck. I envy them that sometimes, the ability to move forward without constantly looking back. Makia was silent for a moment, his dark eyes reflective. The Apache believe that to look backward too often invites the spirits of regret to follow your trail. Better to face the dawn than to chase the setting sun. Your people have many wise sayings, Sarah commented with a small smile. And many foolish ones, Makia admitted, a rare hint of humor in his voice, like all peoples. This simple acknowledgement that his culture was neither more nor less flawed than her own touched Sarah deeply. How different from the attitudes she typically encountered among both whites and natives, each convinced of their own superiority. Makia, she began hesitantly, last night I said there were things that should be said before we part ways. Now I find I don't know how to say them. He turned to face her directly, his expression open in a way she hadn't seen before. Sometimes there are no words in any language for what the heart wishes to express. Yes, Sarah agreed softly. Exactly that. She took a deep breath. But I must try nonetheless. What you did for my children, for me, goes beyond any ordinary kindness. You didn't just save their lives. You showed them a different way of seeing the world, of seeing people who are different from themselves. Makia's gaze didn't waver from hers. They taught me as well. And you? Me? Sarah asked, surprised. Your strength, he said simply. Your dignity in the face of loss. Many would have broken under such burdens, but you carried them with grace. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct praise. Not always with grace, she demurred. There were many dark nights after Thomas died when I raged against God, against fate, against my own helplessness. That, too, is strength, Makia countered, to feel deeply and yet continue. Many men I know would envy such courage. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding. In another life, in another time, perhaps. But such thoughts were futile. Their paths had crossed briefly, meaningfully, but they led in different directions, his back to his people and their traditional ways, hers toward the settled East and the conventional life awaiting her there. I will tell my children about you, Sarah said finally. When they're older and can better understand, about the man who risked everything to save strangers, who showed more humanity than many who share my skin color or faith. I want them to remember, and I will remember them, Makia replied. The boy with eyes like the sky who wanted to learn Apache ways, the girls with their quick smiles and brave hearts, the little one who feared nothing because he knew nothing of fear. He paused, and their mother, who found her strength in the moment of greatest weakness. Lieutenant Parker's voice interrupted this moment of connection. We should move on, Mrs. Blackwood, Makia. I'd like to reach Cottonwood Creek by nightfall. Sarah nodded, rising from the boulder and brushing dust from her skirts. Of course, Lieutenant. As they prepared to resume their journey, Thomas approached Makia with the direct determination of childhood. Mr. Makia, can I ride with you for a while, please? Before Sarah could intervene, Makia looked to her for permission. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. If you're feeling strong enough, Thomas. The boy's face lit up with joy as Makia lifted him onto his horse, then mounted behind him. Hold the mane like this, he instructed, guiding Thomas's small hands to the proper position. Feel how the horse moves beneath you. Listen to his breathing. Thomas followed these instructions with intense concentration, his back straightening as he attempted to mimic Makia's posture. The sight of them together, her fair-haired son and the Apache hunter, created an image Sarah knew would stay with her long after they parted ways. A moment of connection across the boundaries that society insisted must separate them. As they rode on through the afternoon, the terrain gradually changing as they moved away from Apache territory, Sarah found herself storing up memories like treasures. The way the sunlight caught the turquoise at her throat, the sound of her children's voices raised in questions that Makia answered with infinite patience, the vast blue sky that seemed to embrace them all equally, regardless of the artificial divisions humans had created below. Tomorrow would bring Fort Craig, and with it, the beginning of their journey eastward. But today, this moment of transition, of being neither fully in one world nor the other, held its own bittersweet perfection. A gift she had not expected to receive from the tragedy that had nearly claimed everything she held dear. Fort Craig appeared on the horizon late the following afternoon, its adobe walls and wooden watchtowers rising from the desert like a mirage. The American flag snapped in the breeze above the parade ground, a splash of color against the endless blue sky. For Sarah, the sight evoked complicated emotions, relief at reaching safety, gratitude for the assistance it represented, yet also a strange reluctance. The fort marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another, a transition point between the life she was leaving behind and the uncertain future that awaited. As they approached the gates, a sentry called out a challenge that Lieutenant Parker answered with military precision. The gates swung open, revealing the ordered chaos of fort life. Soldiers drilling in the yard, supply wagons being loaded and unloaded, laundry flapping on lines strung between buildings. After the quiet dignity of the Apache village, the bustling activity seemed almost overwhelming. Sarah felt her children draw closer to her, similarly affected by the abrupt return to the white man's world. Only Thomas remained apart, still riding proudly with Makia, his small hands gripping the horse's mane with newfound confidence. The boy's face reflected mingled excitement and apprehension as they rode into the fort, his eyes darting from the soldiers' blue uniforms to the cannons positioned at strategic intervals along the walls. Lieutenant Parker led them to the commander's office, a sparse but well-maintained building near the center of the fort. Colonel Harriman will want to speak with you, he explained to Sarah. A standard procedure when civilians are involved in incidents with the native population, Sarah nodded, though she bristled slightly at the implication that her experience constituted an incident. What had happened between her family and the Apache had been far more profound than could be captured in a military report. Makia remained on his horse outside the office, his posture alert but relaxed, accustomed to the wary glances cast his way by passing soldiers. Thomas still sat before him, reluctant to relinquish this final adventure. "Will you come inside with us, Mr. Makia?" the boy asked, looking up at his rescuer with trust that transcended their different worlds. Makia shook his head gently. "This is a place for your mother to speak with the soldiers, Thomas. I will wait here." Colonel Harriman proved to be a surprisingly courteous man, with graying temples and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades in the harsh southwestern sun. He listened attentively as Sarah recounted the flood, the rescue, and the hospitality shown by Whitehawk's people. "Remarkable," he commented when she had finished, "particularly given the tensions in the territory these past months. Whitehawk has always been among the more moderate chieftains, but even so, this level of assistance to settlers is unusual." "They treated us with nothing but kindness," Sarah emphasized, unwilling to let her family's experience be twisted to fit preconceived notions about the Apache. "My children were welcomed as if they belonged there. The tribal healer tended my injured daughter and my son, who nearly drowned with more care than many white doctors I've encountered." The colonel studied her face, perhaps searching for signs of Stockholm Syndrome or undue influence. Finding none, he nodded thoughtfully. "And Makia, he was your primary contact. He saved my children's lives," Sarah stated firmly, without hesitation, without thought for his own safety. "I owe him a debt I can never repay." "Yes, well," the colonel cleared his throat. "Makia has a complicated history with the U.S.'s government. He served as a scout for several years, proved invaluable during the Bartlett expedition. Then something happened, never quite clear what, and he returned to his people. Refuses military contracts now, though he's still respected by most officers who knew him." Sarah absorbed this information, adding it to her mental portrait of the complex man who had entered her life so unexpectedly. "He mentioned scouting for the army," she said, "but not why he stopped." "Water under the bridge now," Colonel Harriman said dismissively. "What matters is that he brought you and your children safely to us. The fort will provide accommodations until the supply train leaves for Santa Fe in 3 days. From there, you can catch the eastbound stage to the railhead at Las Vegas, and then the train to Pennsylvania." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied, recognizing the conversation's shift to practical matters. "That's very generous. Least we can do for a widow and her children," he said gruffly. Lieutenant Parker mentioned your homestead was destroyed in the flood. Tough luck. The frontier can be unforgiving." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly, "but it also offers unexpected kindnesses." Outside, the children had been given a tour of the fort by a young lieutenant who seemed charmed by their excitement and questions. Sarah found them near the mess hall, where the cook had provided cookies and milk, treats they hadn't tasted since the flood destroyed their homestead. "Mama!" Emma called, her face smeared with crumbs. "The soldiers have real sugar here, and Lieutenant Wilson says we can watch the cannon practice tomorrow." Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, grateful for the resilience of childhood. "That sounds wonderful, Emma. But first, we need to get settled in our quarters and thank Mr. Makia properly before he leaves." The children's faces fell at this reminder. "Does he have to go back today?" Lily asked, her voice small. "Couldn't he stay until we leave on the supply train?" "Mr. Makia has his own life, his own responsibilities," Sarah explained gently. "We've already taken him far from his home." "But he's our friend now," Thomas protested. "Friends don't just say goodbye forever," Sarah knelt to her son's level, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Sometimes, Thomas, people come into our lives for just a short time, but they leave a mark on our hearts that lasts forever. Mr. Makia will always be part of our story, just as we'll be part of his. The boy considered this with solemn eyes. Can I give him something to remember us by? Like the Apache gave us gifts. I think that's a wonderful idea, Sarah agreed. What did you have in mind? Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, the pocket watch that had belonged to his father, one of the few personal items that had survived the flood. Papa's watch, he said simply. Mr. Makia should have it. Sarah's breath caught. The watch was sterling silver, engraved with Thomas Blackwood's initials, one of the few valuable possessions they still owned. Are you sure, Thomas? That was your father's? The boy nodded with the unwavering certainty of childhood. Papa would want him to have it for saving us. Sarah couldn't argue with the simple truth of this statement. Very well. It's a fine gift and very generous of you. They found Makia where they had left him, though he had dismounted and was sharing water with his horse from a trough near the stables. His posture straightened as they approached, a subtle shift from the more relaxed stance he had adopted while waiting. Colonel Harriman has arranged accommodations for us until the supply train departs, Sarah informed him. Ye will be leaving for Santa Fe in 3 days. Makia nodded, his dark eyes taking in the children's faces, now cleaned of cookie crumbs but still bright with the excitement of new experiences. The journey east is long, but safer by train than the trails we traveled in the old days. Will you come back to your village tonight? James asked, his young brow furrowed with concern. It's a long ride alone. I will camp at Cottonwood Creek, Makia replied. Return to my grandfather's fire tomorrow. The desert is a good companion for those who know its ways. An awkward silence fell, heavy with unspoken emotions. The children shifted restlessly, sensing the imminent farewell but reluctant to initiate it. Finally, Thomas stepped forward, holding out his father's watch with both hands. This was my papa's, he said, his voice steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. I want you to have it, to remember us. Makia looked genuinely surprised, his usual composure momentarily shaken as he stared at the valuable timepiece. Thomas, this is too much. Such a thing should stay in your family. You are family now, the boy insisted with the simple certainty of a child. You saved us. That makes you family. Sarah watched as something shifted in Makia's expression, a softening, a vulnerability he had rarely allowed himself to show. With reverent hands, he accepted the watch, turning it over to examine the fine craftsmanship. I will treasure this, he said, his voice lower than usual, and I will think of you when the sun marks the hours of the day. One by one, the children came forward to say their goodbyes. Emma hugged him impulsively around the waist, her small arms barely reaching halfway around. Lily offered a shy smile and a pressed wildflower she had preserved from the Apache village. James shook his hand with solemn dignity, then broke protocol to embrace him briefly. Michael, too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, waved cheerfully from Sarah's arms. Finally, it was Sarah's turn. She stepped forward, acutely aware of the eyes upon them, her children's, the soldiers passing by, perhaps even Colonel Harriman's from his office window. The social constraints of her world seemed to close around her again after the brief freedom she had experienced in the wilderness. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. Words seem inadequate. No thanks are needed, Makia replied, his voice equally low. You would have done the same for any child in danger. Yes, Sarah acknowledged, but few would have done what you did, not just the rescue, but everything that followed. The kindness, the respect, the understanding. She touched the turquoise pendant at her throat. "Then I will never forget." Makia's eyes held hers, and in them she read everything that could not be said aloud. Respect, admiration, and perhaps something deeper that circumstances would never allow them to explore. "The paths we walk are set by forces beyond our control," he said finally. "But where they cross, there is meaning." "Yes," Sarah whispered. "There is meaning." Acting on impulse, she removed the gold locket she wore, a wedding gift from Thomas, containing a tiny portrait of him on one side and a lock of his hair on the other. She pressed it into Makia's hand, closing his fingers around it. "And so you'll remember that not all white settlers see only an Indian when they look at you." His fingers tightened around the locket, and for a breathless moment, Sarah thought he might take her hand in his. Instead, he inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Safe journey, Sarah Blackwood." "And you, Makia," she replied, willing her voice to remain steady. With a final nod to the children, he mounted his horse in a single fluid motion. The animal seemed to sense its rider's mood, prancing slightly as Makia turned it toward the fort gates. He raised his hand once in farewell, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, then urged his mount forward. The sentry opened the gate, and horse and rider passed through, their shapes gradually diminishing as they moved into the vast landscape beyond. Sarah and her children stood watching long after Makia had disappeared from view, each lost in their own thoughts. It was James who finally broke the silence. "He'll be all right, won't he, Mama? Riding alone like that?" Sarah smiled, ruffling her son's hair. "Yes, James. Mr. Makia knows the desert better than anyone. He'll be fine." "And we'll be fine too," Lily added with unexpected wisdom. "Because he showed us how to be brave." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "He did exactly that." 5 years later, a train pulled into the station at Harrisburg to Pennsylvania, its whistle piercing the crisp autumn air. Among the passengers disembarking was a woman in her mid-30s, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a fashionable bonnet, her blue eyes clear and confident as she supervised the unloading of several trunks. "Mud James, please make sure they don't mishandle the crate with Papa's books," she called to a teenage boy who was rapidly approaching the height of a man. "Lily, keep an eye on Michael and Emma." "Yes, Mama," replied a lovely girl of 11, her injured ankle long since healed, with barely a hint of a limp remaining. She took the hand of a 7-year-old boy whose dark eyes sparkled with excitement at the bustling station. "Is Uncle William meeting us with the carriage?" asked another girl, her red hair vibrant against her green traveling dress. "Yes, Emma. He should be here shortly." Sarah Blackwood, now Sarah Mitchell, following her marriage to her sister's widowed brother-in-law 2 years prior, scanned the crowd for her family members. "And to Thomas, don't wander too far." The boy who had nearly drowned in an Arizona flash flood was now 13, tall for his age and possessed of a quiet confidence that reminded Sarah painfully of his father. He stood apart from his siblings, gazing westward down the tracks as though he could see beyond the horizon to the distant territories they had left behind. "Do you think he ever received my letters?" Thomas asked as his mother joined him. Sarah followed his gaze toward the setting sun. "I don't know, Thomas. The Indian agency promised to forward them to the reservation, but..." She let the sentence trail off, unwilling to dampen his hope with the realities of bureaucratic indifference and cultural barriers. Thomas nodded, fingering the small leather pouch he still wore around his neck, Nahimana's gift, now containing not just the original stones and feathers, but also a tiny turquoise bead Sarah had given him on his 10th birthday, a piece carefully extracted from her own pendant. "I'm going back someday," he said with quiet determination. "When I'm older, I want to see the desert again. To thank him in person. Sarah didn't dismiss the declaration as a child's fancy. There was something in her son's expression, a seriousness, a certainty that told her this was no idle wish, but a true intention. "Perhaps you will," she said. "The world is changing. The distances that once seemed insurmountable grow smaller with each passing year." Thomas smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his solemn features. "Do you ever regret leaving?" "Coming back east?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "No," she said finally. "It was the right decision for all of us. You children needed stability, education, family connections." She paused. "But I don't regret what happened before we left either. Some experiences shape us so profoundly that they become part of who we are, no matter where life takes us afterward." "Like the flood," Thomas said, "and Mr. Makia." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "Exactly like that." A carriage approached, driven by a distinguished-looking man in his 40s who waved enthusiastically when he spotted them. Sarah's new husband, William Mitchell, a kind and steady presence who had patiently courted her for a year before she agreed to marry him. He loved her children as his own and never questioned the turquoise pendant she refused to remove, understanding somehow that it represented a chapter of her life that, while closed, remained essential to her story. As the family gathered their belongings and prepared to board the carriage for the final leg of their journey home from a summer visit to relatives in Boston, Sarah cast one last glance westward. Somewhere beyond those endless miles of civilization and wilderness, a proud Apache hunter moved through landscapes she would never see again, carrying a silver pocket watch and a gold locket, tangible connections to lives that had touched his own in ways that defied the boundaries society had established. "Ready, my dear?" William called, extending his hand to help her into the carriage. "Yes," Sarah replied, turning away from the sunset to face the life she had built from the ashes of tragedy. "I'm ready." As the carriage pulled away from the station, Thomas leaned out the window, his gaze still fixed on the western horizon. The last rays of sunlight caught something he wore on a cord around his wrist, a small beaded band in patterns of red and black, made by Apache hands in a village far away. Some connections, Sarah reflected as she watched her son, transcended time and distance, culture and circumstance. Some debts could never be repaid, but could be honored through remembrance and through living the lessons they had taught. The desert had nearly taken everything from her, but through Makia's courage and compassion, it had given her something equally precious, a deeper understanding of humanity's capacity for kindness across the artificial divides of race and background. And perhaps someday, when Thomas was a man and made his journey west to seek the Apache hunter who had saved his life, that understanding would spread a little further, like ripples on the surface of a river that, despite its occasional rage, ultimately connected rather than divided the lands through which it flowed. In the meantime, she had a family to raise, a life to live, and stories to tell. Stories of a flood that destroyed and a courage that rebuilt. Of two worlds briefly united by crisis and compassion. Of a man named Makia who had changed everything by simply doing what he believed was right. Some stories were meant to be remembered. This was one of them,